Get back!
"Take the cloth off?" she asked. The rancher did it, and stood in horror. Narrow Sky was on her knees in the dirt, gasping for breath, her body broken and bleeding. Her simple hide tunic was torn, clinging to her skin, soaked with the alkali dust and her own dark blood. Her face was streaked with soot from the struggle and the silent tears she could not hold back. The hot wind howled across the empty mesa, but nothing could cover the sound of her ragged, choked sobs. She was only 23, but in this moment, a lifetime of suffering was etched onto her bones. Her ribs ached where the heel of a boot had connected. Her hip burned where a rough steel spur had cut. Every inch of her body screamed a high, thin note of agony. Brand Hollis and his enforcer, Silk, had left her to die. They wanted the last dependable spring, the one her people called the Blue Heart, and the land around it. They wanted to wipe the memory of her clan, the few who remained, from this unforgiving stretch of the Arizona territory. When she refused, when she fought back with the ferocity of a trapped mountain cat, they beat her until her physical strength gave way. They laughed as she fell. They called her a savage, a stubborn fool clinging to dry dirt. Brand Hollis had spat on the ground near her face before riding off with Silk, certain that no woman, especially no Apache woman, could rise again from such a punishment. But Narrow Sky had risen. Her legs were weak, tremors running from her knees to her chest, but the will, the spirit of her ancestors, was stronger. She staggered through the blistering wilderness, each step driving splinters of white-hot pain through her flesh. The high desert sun scorched the exposed skin on her back, burning like a final judgment. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The sharp, red rock ground tore at the skin on her knees and palms, but she would not stop. She would not let them win this. Her mind replayed the nightmare. Brand Hollis's huge, gloved hand shoving her into the volcanic dirt. Silk's cruel, high-pitched laugh ringing in the desert stillness. The tearing sound of her father's heirloom shawl. The crushing weight of fists and boots, driven by the cold hunger of greed. She had clawed at their faces with broken nails. She had fought until the dry earth beneath her was stained with her blood and theirs. But they were two men, powerful, ruthless men against one woman. No one from the small, distant trading post had come to help. Now every bruise, every cut, was a blistering reminder of her defiance. Every drop of blood spilled was proof she had not surrendered her right to the Blue Heart Spring. And yet, alone on this empty, indifferent mesa, she could feel hope, that tiny, flickering coal slipping away beneath the relentless Sunday. The world spun around her in a dizzying spiral of dust and pain. Her vision blurred, painting the canyon walls in liquid gold and hazy red. Her lips cracked from an agonizing thirst. She whispered the mantra of her people to herself, again and again, a sound barely audible above the wind. Not here, not like this. But her voice was fading, a lost note on the vast, uncaring plain. She stumbled, dropping to the ground, her bruised knees sinking into the dry, brittle scrub grass. Her trembling hands clutched the tattered piece of her shawl, wrapped tightly around her waist, a desperate, futile effort to keep her dignity intact, to remain whole when everything else was broken. Her breathing grew agonizingly shallow, her body trembled with fever, and her swollen eye half closed as she looked out at the jagged horizon, searching for a sign, for a mountain that she could still climb. Then, through the haze of pain and the shimmer of the heat, she saw him, a rider in the distance, a massive dark silhouette against the sun, a horse galloping across the high plain with the urgent rhythm of a war drum. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, she thought the devils had returned to finish their gruesome work. Her stomach turned to a solid, cold lump of alkali ice, and her body braced for the final blow. But as the figure drew closer, resolving from a shadow into a man, she saw something she did not expect in the hard, unforgiving West. Not the casual cruelty of the land grabber, nor the predatory violence of the outlaw, but a profound, startling concern etched onto his rugged face. The rider pulled his mount to a sudden, dusty halt. He dismounted in one fluid, practiced motion, a worn leather saddle creaking a final protest, and rushed to her side, his large frame blocking the relentless Sunday. He was older, a man forged and weathered by the sun and the hard years. His face, etched with deep lines of solitude and past grief, was marked by years spent laboring under this very desert sky. His voice, when it came, was deep and rough, carrying the urgent resonance of true command. "Hold on now. You're safe. By the Almighty, you're safe." Narrow Sky could not trust so easily. Every lesson taught by the invaders had been one of betrayal and pain. Her lips trembled with the effort of speech. Her voice was barely a whisper, a rustle of dry leaves. "Take the cloth off?" Ben Kincaid froze. The words hit him like a physical blow. He was a man who had seen wounds before, had seen men torn apart by grapeshot in the war, had seen cattle shredded by wolves in the winter snows. He had looked death in the eye enough times to be utterly unshocked by violence. But nothing in his long, bitter life prepared him for the sight of this fragile, beaten young woman. The air around them suddenly felt thick and dangerous, charged not just with heat, but with a palpable, sickening evil. As he knelt and carefully lifted the tattered fabric from her waist, his jaw locked tight, every muscle in his neck going rigid as steel. His breath caught sharply, trapped in his throat like a barbed wire snag. Her body beneath was a canvas of pure human cruelty, a landscape covered in the grotesque purple-black of deep bruises, raw, weeping cuts, and the hideous round welts of burns from a cigarette or a hot iron. Every mark told the unspoken, horrific story of human malice. Every scar cried out a silent plea for justice that Ben Kincaid had thought he was too old, too tired, to ever heed again. Narrow Sky's one good eye locked onto his. It was a gaze that was defiant, utterly without shame. She was physically broken, yes, but her spirit, the core of her being, burned bright with an inextinguishable, untamed fire. She was not begging for pity, nor was she asking for comfort. With that single, unflinching look, she was demanding to be believed, demanding to be defended, demanding that the old rancher's sense of honor be resurrected. Ben Kincaid's heart, a thing he had believed to be hardened granite, pounded against his ribs, a heavy, desperate rhythm against the roar of the desert wind. In that moment, the silent question that burned in both their minds, the only question that mattered on that desolate stretch of dirt, was chillingly clear. Would he, Ben Kincaid, a man who had sworn off the world and its fights, stand by her side and fight for her truth, for her ancestral land, for her people's justice? Or would he ride away, turning his back on the final spark of humanity he possessed, letting the organized evil of men like Brand Hollis reign free across the West? Ben kept staring at Narrow Sky's horrific wounds, the image searing itself into his memory, his stomach turning heavy and cold. He knew this was no ordinary squabble over boundaries or cattle. This was systemic cruelty, simple and profound, aimed at destroying a people and stealing a legacy. Ben Kincaid knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in his gut, that turning away was not an option. Not after what he had just seen. Not after the quiet, unflinching strength in her single, functioning eye. He pulled his canteen from the saddlebag, a worn, heavy tin container, and held it carefully to her parched, cracked lips. Narrow Sky drank, the cool, blessed water spilling down her chin and staining the dust on her throat. Her hands, though shaking violently with fever and shock, gripped the metal fiercely, as if the canteen itself were the only tether connecting her to this world. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a dry, rasping sound, barely a croak, yet the words carried the weight of a monumental, unbowed history. They tried to take everything, our water, the land our ancestors watch over. They said our claims mean nothing to the white man's law. Ben felt his jaw tighten to an impossible degree. His own past was a long chain of losses, a family that vanished, a war that stole his soul, and a subsequent cynicism that had served as his armor for 2 decades. He had seen greed before. He had seen men kill over a single vein of gold or a sliver of river access. But this was different. This was the systematic brutalization of a woman for daring to stand her sacred ground. Narrow Sky coughed, a terrible, rattling sound that shook her small frame. Her breath was ragged and uneven, drawn with immense effort. They said I was nothing. that no reservation law, no treaty, would save me. They wanted my mark on their paper. When I refused to give them the Blue Heart Spring, they beat me until the sun looked black. Her eyes glistened, but not with the weakness of tears. Instead, they held a dangerous, molten fire that refused to die, the very flame of defiance that had first arrested Ben's attention. I will never give it to them. Never. Ben Kincaid placed his rough, aged hand on her shoulder, careful to avoid the deeper, more obvious bruises. His touch was meant as a promise, a physical anchor in her spinning world. You are safe now. I swear by my father's name, I won't let them touch you again. The words were steady, a vow carved in stone, but inside his chest, his tired heart pounded a frantic rhythm. He was just one man older, slower, and weary of conflict, but something about Narrow Sky's sheer, stubborn defiance stirred the sleeping warrior within him, igniting a sense of purpose he thought he had buried deep in a soldier's grave. She attempted to push herself upward, wincing in a fresh, sharp burst of pain. Ben caught her firmly before she could fall back to the dirt. Even beaten, even profoundly broken, Narrow Sky's spirit was wild, unchained, and fierce as the wildest part of the desert itself. She muttered through clenched, dry teeth, the thought a burning ember. They will return for me. Men like that, they always return to finish what they start. Ben helped her carefully onto his horse, the powerful gelding shifting impatiently beneath the weight of two riders. He swung up behind her, steadying her frail body with one large, protective arm wrapped around her bruised ribs. The high desert sun was sinking now, a magnificent, bleeding orb, painting the vast, endless horizon in shades of violent red and funereal gold. It should have been a beautiful, peaceful spectacle, but all Ben Kincaid saw was the lurking, predatory danger hidden in the deepening shadows. He knew Brand Hollis and his kind, men whose greed was a cancer, whose ambition was a law unto itself. They did not simply forget a slight or concede a defeat. They would chase her, stalk her, and attempt to break her until they got what they wanted, or until they had buried her. Narrow Sky leaned against him, her voice muffled against his worn leather vest, barely above the whisper of the wind over the rocks. You don't even know my name. Why would you help me? Why risk your peace? Ben's eyes narrowed, fixed on the distant, faint flicker of light from the small, wretched town they called Dust Devil Crossing. He guided the horse along a barely visible game trail, his focus absolute. Because what they did to you, no living creature deserves that. And because if men like Brand Hollis keep winning, if they can take the water and the land and the dignity of people just by throwing enough fists and money around, then this land is already damned. It isn't worth living in. The horse, sensing the tension and the urgency, galloped through the tall, dry yellow grass, its hooves pounding a heavy, relentless rhythm against the packed earth. Sounding like the drums of war Ben thought he'd left behind forever. He felt Narrow Sky's fragile weight against him, yet within that weight was something profoundly unbroken, a solid core of steel. He thought of the sheriff in Dust Devil Crossing, a man named Deputy Vance, a known pawn of Hollis. He thought of the so-called law, and how easily it bent and crumbled under the weight of gold and power in these remote parts. Sometimes, he realized, true, honorable justice demanded a firmer, less legal hand. As the scattered, miserable lights of Dust Devil Crossing began to prick the fading twilight in the distance, Ben Kincaid knew one thing with terrible clarity. He was no longer just helping a stranger. He was stepping deliberately back into a fight that would undoubtedly cost him his peace, his solitude, and perhaps everything else he possessed. But what choice did a man of old-world honor truly have when confronted with such calculated, sickening evil? He considered circling the town, finding a doctor outside the reach of Hollis, but Narrow Sky suddenly shifted, her voice regaining a thread of its strength. The Blue Heart Spring, it is all we have. If I do not show my face in town, if I do not stand up for it now, Brand will claim I ran. I must face them. Her resolution settled the matter. Ben had intended to take her toward the deputy's poorly lit office, hoping the thin veneer of law could offer temporary protection. But before they reached the first outskirts of the town, before the dusty street even widened into a recognizable thoroughfare, two looming figures blocked their path outside the notorious Golden Spur Saloon. Brand Hollis, a huge, well-dressed man whose expensive black coat seemed unnaturally pristine in the desert dust, and his skinny, cruel accomplice, Silk, were waiting. Smug, predatory smiles spread across their faces like a spreading stain of poison. The dirt street fell silent with terrible suddenness. A few townspeople, the pathetic hangers-on and desperate miners, backed slowly away from the brewing trouble in the humid evening air, their faces pale with fear. Brand Hollis's voice boomed across the sudden stillness, dripping with false concern and menace. "Well, look at what the old dog dragged in. The little savage thought she could run all the way back to her reservation, did she?" Ben had no choice but to push the horse forward, directly into the widening doors of the Golden Spur Saloon. He guided the horse inside, forcing every eye in the smoke-filled, dimly lit room to see what was about to unfold, what he was carrying. Narrow Sky pulled Ben's large, rough-spun coat tighter around her bruised body, a pathetic gesture of self-preservation, but her good eyes still burned with that unwavering fire. She refused to hide, even with her face swollen and her body aching. She wanted the entire wretched town to know she was still standing, still breathing, still fighting. Ben was just about to dismount, his hand resting on the heavy Schofield revolver strapped to his hip, when the bat-wing doors creaked open with dramatic slowness. The already quiet room descended into an absolute, deathly silence. Brand Hollis and Silk strolled in, their smirks spreading like that same noxious poison. They spotted Narrow Sky immediately, their eyes raking over her with contempt. "Well, look at that," Silk sneered, his voice high and grating. "The girl's still breathing. I guess old Ben's got to be our nursemaid now." Ben Kincaid rose slowly from the saddle, his tall frame uncoiling to its full height, his fists clenching, ready to shield her, ready to draw. But before the first word of challenge could leave his dry lips, Narrow Sky moved. She stood abruptly, her body swaying precariously, her legs unsteady, yet her eyes locked onto the two massive figures who had tried to destroy her. Her body screamed a plea for her to stay down, to seek darkness and silence, but the indomitable pride of her spirit forced her onto her feet, balancing precariously in the saddle. "Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second, and tell us where you're watching from if you love Wild West love stories." Narrow Sky stood in the saddle, a terrifying, beautiful vision of raw courage framed in the dim, smoky light of the Golden Spur Saloon. The room was packed with hardened men, miners, drifters, and other lowlifes, but every single eye was fixed on the small, battered Apache woman facing down the town's most powerful man. Her voice, miraculously, carried through the sudden, echoing silence, thin yet sharp as a newly honed obsidian blade. "You think I will bow to you, Hollis?" she shouted, though the effort sent a fresh jolt of pain tearing through her ribs. "You can break my bones, but you will never take the Blue Heart Spring. You'll never take our land." A gasp filled the room, quickly followed by a low, approving murmur from the edges of the bar. It was the gasp of men who were used to violence, but were profoundly shocked by the sight of true, unyielding defiance. Hollis's face, which had been set in a confident sneer, tightened with raw, ugly fury. Narrow Sky grabbed a half-empty whiskey bottle from the table nearest the horse's head, a gesture born of pure, reckless instinct, and hurled it with the last reserves of her strength. It didn't hit Hollis, but it smashed against the wall inches from Silk's head. Shards of glass scattered across the dirty wooden floor, the sound shattering the tension like a gunshot. The room erupted. Hollis lunged with a guttural roar, but Ben Kincaid had already moved. Ben had dismounted the moment Narrow Sky spoke, and his heavy, right fist shot out, catching the much larger man with a hard, flat punch to the jaw. Hollis staggered, stunned more by the unexpected attack than the force. Chairs toppled and splintered. Men scrambled backward, knocking over tables, desperate to clear a path from the impending chaos. The pathetic piano player, sensing that his last 3 minutes of life had just arrived, ducked for cover beneath his instrument. Silk, recovering instantly, tried to push past Ben, his hand sweeping toward the worn grip of his own revolver. But just as he moved, Narrow Sky, abandoning the saddle, dropped precariously to the floor. She planted herself directly between Silk and Ben Kincaid, her body shaking violently with exhaustion and pain, but her stance fixed and resolute. "You'll have to go through me first," she cried, her voice steady and unbroken. She knew, with chilling certainty, that she could not win a physical battle against these two brutal men, but standing firm, demanding that they recognize her as a person, not a disposable object, not a piece of paper to be signed, meant keeping the dignity of her ancestors alive. That single, defiant moment froze everyone in the Golden Spur Saloon. The sight of a battered, half-starved young Apache woman, standing tall and utterly unafraid against two heavily armed, ruthless white men, was a tableau of moral force that silenced even the most cynical drunkard. No one laughed now. Even the cowhands and miners, men who usually saw the Native Americans as less than dirt, were muttering among themselves, their voices low and impressed. "She's got more fight than a dozen men in this town put together," one grizzled prospector admitted grudgingly, nodding his appreciation. The confrontation was stopped, not by Hollis or Ben, but by the sudden, dramatic burst of the saloon doors. Judge Gideon Thorne stormed in, his old-fashioned Sharps rifle held ready in his hands, its brass-mounted stock gleaming in the dim light. Judge Thorne was a federal magistrate assigned to the territory, and one of the only men in Dust Devil Crossing not bought and paid for by Brand Hollis. His face was thunderous. The townspeople, sensing a chance at actual, honest-to-God justice, spoke up right away. Every scared, silent witness who had watched the confrontation and the initial arrival of the broken woman was suddenly ready to tell the judge exactly what had happened, exactly who was the aggressor, and exactly why Narrow Sky was standing there covered in cuts and bruises. They poured out the story of Hollis's greed, his brutality, and his attempt to steal the Blue Heart Spring. Within minutes, Brand Hollis and Silk were dragged out of the Golden Spur Saloon, cursing, spitting, and threatening terrible vengeance against the turncoat citizens, but their mocking smirks had vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, impotent rage. The saloon slowly, awkwardly returned to its noise, the clink of glasses, the resumed rattle of the piano keys, though every eye stayed fixed on Narrow Sky. They had seen something that night that transcended the simple, ugly lawlessness of the West. They had witnessed not weakness, nor fear, but the raw, spiritual courage of a woman who refused to be conquered. Ben Kincaid helped her gently back to the nearest table, sitting her down on a stable, plush chair, the pride he felt a steady, warming flame in his weary chest. For the first time since he'd first ridden into this bitter territory, he realized Narrow Sky was not just someone he had rescued, not just someone he had chosen to protect. She was someone truly worth fighting beside, no matter the final, devastating cost. She was the one who had awakened him from his long, self-imposed emotional death. The Sheriff Deputy Vance, a miserable, frightened man, finally arrived, late as always, to find the judge already in charge. Vance tried to argue, tried to claim jurisdiction, but Judge Thorne, a man Ben instinctively knew was honest, cut him off with a chillingly cold stare. "The woman goes with Kincaid. The prisoners go in chains. We hold a hearing at the courthouse in the morning. If Hollis touches her or Kincaid before then, Deputy, I swear I'll have your badge and your hide." Vance backed down, his face pale, unable to challenge the federal authority. Ben led Narrow Sky out into the cooling night air, guiding her to the one respectable boarding house in town. The moment they were alone in the small, clean room, the adrenaline that had kept her upright finally faded. She collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling uncontrollably, the exhaustion a crushing weight. Ben sat beside her, simply keeping vigil, cleaning her minor cuts with cool water and bandages, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man of his size and age. The deeper wounds, the broken ribs, required the skills of the town's doctor, a dour, silent man who demanded payment in gold and asked no questions, but who worked with competence. Narrow Sky fell into a feverish sleep. Ben watched her, the weight of his honor settling firmly back onto his shoulders. He was an observer turned participant, a lone drifter now tasked with protecting a legacy that was not his own, but which had become inextricably linked to his own redemption. He knew the fight was far from over. Brand Hollis had only been temporarily inconvenienced. The courthouse hearing in the morning would be a spectacle, a mockery, but they had to play the white man's game to legitimize her claim. They had to fight. As Ben Kincaid sat there in the silence, listening to her shallow, painful breaths, he took out the small, framed photo. He always carried a blurred image of his own lost wife and children, and silently made a new vow. He would see this through. He would see Narrow Sky safe, no matter what it cost him. Hey there. Friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. The courthouse in Dust Devil Crossing was less a place of justice and more a poorly constructed, dust-choked theater for corruption. It smelled of cheap pine, stale tobacco smoke, and the perpetual, cold sweat of fear. The benches creaked ominously as the few honest townspeople, along with a significant number of Hollis's paid-off miners, filled every available seat. Judge Thorne sat elevated on a worn platform, his face a mask of weary determination. Ben Kincaid sat close to Narrow Sky, his large, solid presence, a silent barrier against the town's judging eyes. She was still bruised, still clearly in pain, but her spine was straight and her chin was held high. She had been beaten by the brute force of greed, but she was entirely unbroken in spirit, a fact that every man in the room, friend or foe, could see and respect. When Brand Hollis was brought in, flanked by the nervous Deputy Vance and the contemptible Silk, he swaggered despite the chains. His tailored clothes were slightly ripped from the saloon fight. His jaw was swollen where Ben's fist had connected, and his eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Narrow Sky with a promise of terrible, future retribution. Brand Hollis, and your accomplice Silk, Judge Thorne's voice, though old, possessed an unyielding core of steel. You stand accused of assault, attempted coercion, and the illegal seizure of native water and land rights. How do you plead? Hollis sneered, his mouth only half forming the words due to the swelling. Not guilty, Your Honor. The woman is trespassing on federal ground. I was merely removing a persistent nuisance. Her water rights are a tribal fantasy that expired with the last treaty. Silk smirked beside him, utterly confident in his employer's ability to buy their way out. Judge Thorne, however, was not moved by the display of arrogance. He turned to Narrow Sky, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. Her hands trembled, not from fear of the men, but from the immense gravity of the moment, the weight of her entire people resting on her small shoulders. As she stood, she was forced to lean slightly on the edge of the table for support, but her voice did not falter, projecting across the silent room with unexpected clarity and power. They tried to silence the voice of my father's father, she testified, looking directly at the judge, ignoring the glaring menace of Hollis. They did not want my mark on their paper, they wanted my silence. The Blue Heart Spring is not just water. It is the life of our people. The spring is the only thing that keeps my kin from starvation and leaving this land forever. I told them no. I will keep saying no until the Great Spirit calls me home. The crowd murmured, a small wave of approval filling the tense air and acknowledgement of her moral truth, even if they were too afraid to back it up. For a moment, the arrogance on Brand Hollis's face wavered, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. Then Ben Kincaid rose, his massive, scarred figure unfolding from the chair, drawing all eyes. His voice was rough, a low rumble, but steady and resonant with years of hard-won experience. I have lived in these parts for 55 years, Judge. I've seen men fight for less than a thimble of dust, but I have never in all my days seen a woman fight like this one. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the room, settling finally on the judge. Hollis and his kind talk about law and treaties, but where is the law when two armed men beat a woman half to death for a drink of water? If this land means nothing to your law, Judge, if greed can wipe out a people and steal their legacy without consequence, then what the hell is the point of any of us standing here? That raw, honest plea for honor and integrity struck a deep chord. The judge leaned back, running a tired hand over his face. He knew the law was flawed, that Brand Hollis could, and likely would, appeal any criminal conviction until it vanished in the bureaucracy of the territorial capital. The system was rigged, but the moral verdict, the simple, undeniable truth of the moment, was Ben Kincaid's to deliver. The verdict came, swift and unsatisfying, a compromise forged in a corrupt system. Hollis and Silk were not convicted of assault, the judge, citing a lack of physical evidence beyond hearsay in the initial attack. The sheriff's report was notably lacking, but they were found guilty of disturbing the sprecket, of gradance evidence beyond hearsay, of the evidence beyond hearsay, pieces and illegal coercion in the saloon. They were fined a staggering sum, one that hurt Hollis's pocket, but not his power, and they were ordered to cease all harassment of Narrow Sky's ancestral claims for a period of 6 months under penalty of federal indictment. It was a moral victory, a public humiliation for Hollis, but a legal failure. Narrow Sky had won the battle, but not the war. Applause thundered through the small courthouse, but Ben saw the deep, chilling frustration on Narrow Sky's face. She had risked everything for a 6-month reprieve. When the gavel struck, Hollis's eyes met Ben's, and the look was a cold, hard promise of death. Ben placed his hand on Narrow Sky's shoulder, his voice firm. "It's not enough. They can't hurt you legally for 6 months. But Brand doesn't play by the law. He'll send men." Narrow Sky nodded, her face wet with tears of frustration and sheer, agonizing relief. "The law only protects Hollis, Ben Kincaid. The law is his paper, not mine." When the courthouse emptied and the townsfolk chastened, but not truly changed, drifted back to their homes, Narrow Sky and Ben stepped out into the fading afternoon light. The sky above the mesa burned with fierce, angry streaks of orange and gold. For the first time in days, Narrow Sky took a deep breath without the cold paralysis of fear clawing at her chest. Ben walked beside her, his boots crunching against the dirt road. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and solemn. "You stood taller than any man in there today. Don't ever forget that, Narrow Sky." "Oof." She smiled faintly, her face still a map of bruises, but the light in her spirit was shining through, catching the golden hour light. "I thought I was alone, Ben Kincaid. For so long I thought I was the last of my line. Turns out I was just waiting for someone who believes in the old ways, in honor." They reached his horse and paused. The town behind them buzzed with life, but out on the horizon lay the open, endless badlands, quiet, dangerous, and free. Ben looked at her, seeing not just a wounded girl fighting for water, but a partner in courage. He had spent years believing the West had taken more from him than it ever gave his wife, his children, his faith in goodness. But in that moment, he realized the land, the Great Spirit, could still offer something back, a chance at redemption. Narrow Sky placed a small, steady hand on his arm, her touch a spark of fire against his worn leather sleeve. "You gave me more than safety. You gave me a reason to keep fighting a fight that was already lost. I will go home now, Ben. To the spring. It is my duty." The rancher, weathered and worn, felt the sudden, crushing weight of loneliness return. He knew her duty was sacred, but he also knew going back meant death. The 6 months' grace was merely a head start. He looked at the vast, terrifying horizon and then back at the tiny, fiercely determined woman standing beside him. He wasn't giving up. He made a different vow, one that included his own lost soul. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Narrow Sky was not foolish enough to believe that a piece of paper signed by a tired judge could hold back Brand Hollis. She was Apache. She knew the true law of the frontier was written in lead and in blood. Her destination, the Blue Heart Spring, was 100 miles of unforgiving, tracked desert away. They had made it barely 5 miles from Dust Devil Crossing, the sun sinking low enough to cast long, treacherous shadows, when Ben Kincaid slowed his horse and gripped his rifle tighter. His hand was steady, but his jaw was rigid. 5 riders, Narrow Sky. Coming fast. They're not turning back. Brand Hollis had not waited 6 months for a legal appeal. He had simply cut his losses, paid the fine, and sent the true executioners a posse of hard-eyed, mounted gunmen, led by the grinning brute, Silk, to eliminate the problem. This was the final, inevitable confrontation, taking place not in a civilized courtroom, but in the desolate, primal theater of the Badlands. Ben and Narrow Sky didn't run. Ben dismounted, using the horse as cover, pulling a heavy repeating rifle from the saddle holster. Narrow Sky, despite her still healing body, slid down and immediately melted into the shadow of the nearest red rock formation, her eyes scanning the landscape. This was her ground, the land her people had navigated for centuries. She didn't have Ben's firepower, but she possessed an ancestral knowledge that could outflank any white man's tactics. "They'll split up and circle," she whispered, her voice low and tight, coming from a crevice Ben couldn't even see. "Silk always tries to flank to the south, near the dry creek bed. Hollis uses the ridge for cover. I know their habits. They are predictable, like the buzzards." Ben felt a surge of respect, a confirmation of the true, raw power beneath her fragile exterior. They were no longer protector and protected. They were partners in survival, a single unit forged in fire. The first shots rang out, echoing deafeningly in the twilight canyons. Ben returned fire, his aim precise, forcing Silk's approaching riders to dismount and scatter behind a cluster of boulders. He laid down suppressive fire, his ancient Winchester spitting hot brass and smoke. Meanwhile, Narrow Sky slipped away, moving with a silent grace he could barely track, heading straight towards the south flank she had predicted. She was a spirit of the land, using every dip, every shadow, every broken piece of rock as concealment. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. She circled wide, using the knowledge of a hidden passage, a narrow, barely visible trail to emerge directly behind the 3 riders flanking south. She didn't have a rifle. She used what she had. A sudden, terrifying yell, a high, ancient Apache war cry that froze the blood, burst from the rocks. She released 2 carefully hurled stones, stunning 2 horses just enough to send them panicking. The riders were thrown into disarray, losing their rifles and their bearings. One rider foolishly turned his back on Ben's position, and Ben Kincaid, seeing the perfect opening, fired. The fight was sharp, brutal, and over quickly. Ben's skill with the rifle, combined with Narrow Sky's intimate knowledge of the canyons, was a lethal, unstoppable force. Silk and his remaining thug were forced to retreat, racing back towards Dust Devil Crossing. Their mission failed, their horses running with the frantic panic of defeat. Ben walked over to Narrow Sky, his body trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline of action and the relief of a shared victory. They looked at each other, standing over the defeated bodies and abandoned rifles. There was no need for words, no need for declarations of cowboy love stories or Wild West love. The truth was in their eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by an ironclad trust and a mutual, deep-seated purpose. The bond formed in the saloon was sealed here in the blood and dust of the Badlands. They could have ridden back to the Blue Heart Spring. They could have used the captured rifles to fortify their position and wait for Brand Hollis's inevitable final, fatal attempt. But Narrow Sky looked not at the spring, nor at the small, dark town they had just escaped. She looked west, towards the vast, purple mountains that seemed to stretch into eternity. "We can't stay, Ben Kincaid," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The spring is safe for now. They think we are dead or running. But my heart is not here anymore. Not in the white man's towns, and not in the reservation. My father told me the Great Spirit wants us to be free, not to stand still and wait for the next fight to find us." Ben understood perfectly. The Wild West love story they were building was not about settling down in a safe, picket-fenced homestead. It was about healing through perpetual motion, through freedom, through shared adventure. It was about taking control of their own horizon. It was a complete, final self-redemption. He looked at the vast, daunting emptiness of the unexplored territory, the Wild West love waiting beyond the last known map. He saw the path of a man who had been dead inside for 20 years, now revived by the fierce spirit of an Apache woman. He swung up into the saddle, offering his hand down to Narrow Sky. She took it, her grasp strong,